In this series of videos, we're going to be looking at flooding. We'll look at why it happens, the hazards, and some of the ways that we can actually prevent or reduce the effects of flooding. So here's a great way to start off this particular discussion. What's the deadliest natural disaster in recorded human history? Now, oftentimes when we're talking about deadly natural disasters, we think of big events like volcanoes or sudden events like earthquakes or things that affect a really big area like tsunamis. But actually, the deadliest event in recorded human history is simply a set of floods. Now, these floods happened in China over a period of months, starting in 1931. Now, the setup for this is pretty specific. From 1928 to 1930, they had a really long drought. You would think that having lots of water after a drought would be a good thing, except as the land dries out and the soil dries out, it's unable to absorb much rainwater. And so when it does rain after a drought, you get a lot of runoff and surface flow and what's called sheet flow, where rather than going into a channel, the water just kind of flows as one big sheet across the land. They started having some strange weather during the winter of 1930. They had a lot of heavy snowstorms followed by a spring thaw cycle with really heavy rains as well. The rain increased into July and August of 1931. In July alone, there were 7 cyclones that hit the region. Now that's basically a hurricane. We just call them cyclones when they are in that part of when they affect Asia. So in 1 month, there were 7 cyclones that hit China. On average, they get 2 a year. And so that's like almost 4 years worth of hurricanes all within a month. In all, there were over 70,000 square miles that were flooded, often standing 10 to 15 feet deep for periods of 3 to 6 months. So this is a significant amount of flooding across a large part of China. Human casualties have a really big margin of error. They're estimated anywhere between 145,000 to nearly 4 million. Now that's a big range, right? But if we take into account the political system of China at the time, there's a lot of reasons to hide those really big numbers, or at least to try to keep those from becoming common knowledge. These images here you see on the screen are some of the worst hit areas, like Gayu Lake. This particular flood happened, or this event happened August 26th, 1931. The lake was swollen to record levels. And it backed up pressure in 2 of the largest lakes in China. Eventually, what happened on the day of August 26th is that the levees along the edge of Gayu Lake failed, and the water rushed into the town. It's estimated that 10,000 people died just that morning. They describe the newspaper descriptions describe dead bodies everywhere and compared it to floating fish passing down the river. A total of 77,000 people would die in the ensuing months from diseases and starvation in this area alone. And so the flooding wasn't just a matter of being washed away by the floods, but it's a long-term effects of months-long rain and water standing everywhere. So these pictures are some of them are pretty rough to see. The picture on the right, you can actually see one of those bodies floating. The picture on the left is actually part of that failure of the levee system there. One of the most interesting things about this photo is, if you notice, it was actually taken by Charles Lindbergh. For those of you who aren't up on your history there, Charles Lindbergh was a really famous pilot. He set a bunch of records like circumnavigating the globe solo. By 1931, flying had become something of an everyday sort of event. And on this particular trip, Charles and his wife were actually flying all the way around the world, and he happened to stop in China during these floods and take quite a few pictures, which is where quite a few of these that I've got in here come from. You can see this is the city of Gayu and the flooding in the streets, and there's people you can see standing on houses or crowding together just trying to get away from it. In part, as a reaction to this flood and other floods that happen along the Yellow River in China, the country decided to build a dam, and it was finally completed back in the 1990s. It's what we know as the Three Gorges Dam. The Three Gorges Dam blocks the river, and behind it is a large reservoir of water. This is the largest reservoir in the world. That means it's the largest man-made lake. It currently holds 39,300,000 cubic meters of water. The second largest is a tiny fraction of that and only holds a little over 540,000 cubic meters of water. So you can see just how big this is. Now, the building of the dam and the filling of the reservoir took a toll on the area because they had to displace all the people that lived where the reservoir is currently. And so they ended up relocating somewhere around 1.2 million people as it started filling. It destroyed major ecosystems throughout the area. It flooded ancient archaeological sites. I've seen images of archaeologists trying to grab what they can and run from ancient sites built into some of the cliffs in the area. It flooded out some major geologic features that were really well known. One of the hard parts, it actually crosses two major faults. Now we know from Lake Mead, which has faults in that area up in the California, Nevada, Arizona kind of confluence there. We know Lake Mead has small earthquakes within that region as the lake levels rise and fall. And so having this large of water in China crossing major faults that are well known and known to be active is pretty scary. And if you look at the historic record, there are other dams that have triggered earthquakes in China. The largest one was a magnitude 6.1 in 1962. And overall, there's at least 19 earthquakes that have been blamed on these dams throughout the country. There's also some concern about the engineering and the structural integrity of the dam. And if you look at the map of the places that are downstream of this, in particular, Wuhan has become quite well known in the news because of its role in the COVID outbreak. But it does sit just downstream from the Three Gorges Dam, and any problems along the dam would likely result in major flooding and major damage in the city.